Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we delve into an issue that we've never really touched on before, but which many specialists consider to be an emerging, increasingly acute global crisis, and that's the crisis of dementia. Before we dive into that very complex but immediate domain, particularly for the elderly, I want to make a few comments as I've reflected on our really an extraordinary session that we had yesterday with Michael Negler and Rabbi Kat Zavis about the roots of the current Middle East crisis in Judeo-Christianity, and in particular the anti-Semitism of the Christians against the Jews, the refusal and inability of Europe and Christianity to repent of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust, and instead, as both our speakers and myself discussed, projecting onto the Middle East all the issues that were left unresolved in Europe. And that's why we see today genocide in Gaza, like we saw genocide in Germany and in Eastern Europe 80 years ago. I'm going to put in the chat in a few minutes a YouTube interview with Gabor Mate, who is the great medical doctor and specialist in trauma, a Hungarian Jew born in the midst of the Second World War, and most of his family were lost to the Holocaust. So his remarks on what's going on there are particularly profound. He considers Zionism to be one of the greatest mistakes in all of Jewish history, and what is going on in Gaza and the West Bank to be literally an unspeakable horror. The one point that he made, which I want to underscore because I think it's very important for us to be clear-eyed about what's actually going on here, as the United States and Israel jointly, strategically, with unified military commands, transact everything that we see. All the rhetoric notwithstanding, there is no doubt of the alliance structure and what the United States and Israel are doing together now to foment war at a regional level in the Middle East. The point that Gabor Mate makes about the prevalence of Israeli sadism on social media in Israel, as soldiers in Gaza and the West Bank dance for joy as they slaughter Palestinians, throw the Palestinians off roofs, engage in sodomy on film of Palestinian prisoners, burn people alive and celebrate that on social media. He says that what's happening in Israel is the same phenomenon that seized the German psyche at the end of the Second World War, where they lost the capacity to stop their own self-destruction. That at some point, the psyche, when it engages in mass murder, atrocities of all kinds, ultimately brings the house down upon itself. So we may be seeing a conflagration in the Middle East that is in keeping with that logic of Nazism, of genocide, of escalating violence that becomes insatiable to the people who are transacting it. It's like a drug. On the news today, it said that in the last 48 hours, Israel has bombed over 340 targets in Lebanon, not using precision-guided bombs, but using the same 2,000-pound unguided bombs that they've been using on Gaza to maximize civilian casualties. In the last 24 hours, 65 more Palestinians were killed in Gaza by mass bombings. In the northern end of Gaza, in the Jubalia refugee camp, over 400,000 Palestinians are now being kept without food or water by the Israelis. They've sealed it off. And even though they have said they weren't going to do it, they in fact are doing it. And people are dying as we speak. This is an escalation of violence. And it's going to end in a few days or a few weeks with an attack on Iran that's going to have consequences that are incalculable. The point that Gabor Mate makes in the interview that I'm going to put up, which all of you should read or watch, is that when this level of self-destruction seizes the psyche, the only way for it to stop is for a third force to come in and somehow bring it to a close. But the Israelis are no longer capable of doing that on their own. And I fear the United States is no longer capable of doing it on its own. And that's a measure of the predicament in which we all find ourselves. At the end of the interview, he was asked by the interviewer, so how do you hold this? How do you hold the unspeakable? And I think all of us are in that situation with Gaza. How do we hold the unspeakable? And Gabor made a beautiful, beautiful statement. He says, all you can do is let the feelings flow through you in a spirit of compassion. Compassion for the Palestinians, compassion for the Israelis, compassion for the Americans, compassion for the Lebanese, the Iranians, the Houthis. And let the feelings just flow. Don't try to keep them away. Don't try to exaggerate them. Just be with the horror. And our capacity to be with the horror in an extraordinarily mystical and incomprehensible way is what allows redemption to emerge, even if it's in only our own souls. So thank you, everyone, for joining. As you know, the issue in Gaza is very present in my heart and soul. I'll be referring to it more consistently now that I'm back from my travels. It's essential, as I've said before, that we not look away. I want to now turn our attention to an issue that most of us find in our daily lives, in our families, people that we know, and that's the issue of dementia. And I want to introduce Bettina Wichers, who I've come to know recently, who was recommended as someone who has a very interesting analysis and perspective on the phenomenon of dementia. So Bettina is going to make a presentation, and then I'll circle back and we'll dialogue for the balance of the time. She'll be joining all of us in the after chat when we're all done. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome Bettina Wichers. Bettina?
Thank you very much, Jim, for the introduction. Yes, I will share my screen, or no, I think I have some remarks before I start, and it's better that I'm visible at that point. Before I start, I have some remarks because first I will report about insights on to dementia first, which emerge out of a very personal journey, a very personal experience, a process, a transformational process I underwent in the last years. And this process made myself very vulnerable. And I think from time to time you will recognize this, that there is still a vulnerability due to this process. I'm at the beginning of talking about that, and it took a while until I took the courage to speak openly about that. That is one thing. And you will recognize why you were listening to the descriptions of my process, that perhaps there will come up some thoughts about the process, that something went wrong in my process, or that something I should have done something different. And I want to ask you just to bear in mind and to witness that this process I underwent had to be in this way, because otherwise I couldn't have gained the insights I gained. And one last remark, that we had a short exchange before this event started. When I'm talking about dementia, I sometimes forget that people are not so deeply involved into that. Dementia is the overarching expression. It's a description of the whole symptom of neurodegenerational processes, and Alzheimer's is one form of dementia. It's the most known, most diagnosed forms. There are more forms. It's frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, and vascular dementia too. So just for your information before I start, I don't have that on my presentation. So I will start my presentation now. Yes, and I talk about dementia, the dissolution of the self, and extraordinary experiences of consciousness. And I want to introduce a little bit about myself first, because this is important, that you know about my professional and my personal background, because out of all this knowledge, or all these insights I will share with you today arise. I'm an educationalist. It's Diplom-Pädagogin in German, specialized in adult education, and a gerontologist. I have a Master of Science in gerontology. That's a science of aging, specialized in dementia, and a lot of other qualifications in the field of adult education and gerontology and geropsychiatry. And as this, I worked for more than 20 years as a teacher in nursing schools, as a trainer for communication with people with dementia in nursing homes, and as a clinical supervisor in geropsychiatric care. And this was the part of my work I loved most. And I really liked this working with people with dementia, and especially with the caregivers in geropsychiatric care units. And as this clinical supervisor, I was something like a professional witness of the state of consciousness of many people with dementia. And I think this is an important, I have to emphasize that for me, dementia is not a disease, but a state of consciousness. While I worked as a clinical supervisor, I witnessed something in people with severe dementia. What at that time I didn't find words for, but today, after my own a process of many years, about which I will talk next, I can name it, and this is the unconscious emptiness. And everybody who has been close to people with dementia perhaps have a resonance to this state when they're in silence, especially people with severe dementia, late stage dementia, that they're in an emptiness, but it's an unconscious emptiness. And perhaps this is also interesting. I'm integral informed. I'm in the integral theory, in the integral field since around 2002. I developed an epistemological motivated integral dementia concept in my gerontological master thesis in 2011. You can find this on my website in the English section. I've translated it there. And I worked with several developmental models. So this is where I'm coming from professionally. And and a little bit about my personal background of the last years who brought me to this insights I'm talking about. I had myself an extraordinary experience of consciousness 6 years ago in autumn of 2018. I had the wrong description, but you're lacking words if you try to describe such experiences. This was an experience of nothingness. It took me some years until I found a proper description in the spiritual scriptures. This is the expression of ajata. Ajata means no creation. The description for this experience is that you're having the experience of even nothingness does not exist. I came into this experience that I never intended. I was not on a spiritual path. I didn't have a spiritual teacher, and I came into this without any explicit spiritual practice. But as I know today, it was induced by scientific contemplation. It happened while I was contemplating a scientific text about consciousness development. And suddenly it happened, chip, chip, chip. It was just three short moments, just finger snaps, in which everything dissolved and I was left with a knowledge of nothingness. Nothing ever came into existence. And after this snap, 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 I was back in my living room. Nothing has changed in the outside, and everything has changed in my awareness, in my kind of perceiving this world. And the first question when I came back, when I was back, and when I recognized what happened with me, was a question: how can I live with that? And this experience of nothingness, or this awareness of nothingness, of the full illusion of this existence, never went away in my life. It's there with me, and I really had no idea how one can live with that. And interestingly, one of my next thoughts was, I have to start to think about dementia from the beginning anew. And so I did. But first, I went through a dissolution process on my own over years. Everything dissolved in my life. My relationships dissolved, my whole life dissolved. My work dissolved due to the COVID-19 situation. 2 years later, I lost all my contracts in the psychiatric care. I gave up my apartment because I knew that I can't live there in this environment any longer. And the most challenging part of this dissolution process was when my sense of motherhood dissolved. That was really, really difficult. I have a now 24-year-old son, and it was around his age of 21, 22 when I recognized this, and this was the most problematic thing. And over the years, especially, something has dissolved, and this was myself. This, sometimes it's said sense of self, but it's really this myself, the self I had, I was, is gone. It never came back in the sense that I had it before. So this dissolution process brought up the often reported aftermath of a deep, deep spiritual transformative experience. I went through tons of anxiety, despair, shame, a lot of shame about that, because I thought, why does it happen to me? I never wanted to have this experience. This is meant for monks, experienced meditators or something like that, but not for me. And I was unable to talk about that because nobody understood me. I went through a huge disorientation, confusion, and lots of trauma reactivation over years. And while I went through this process, trying to grasp what was happening, I recognized in my own process the similarities of my own experiences to dementia symptoms, which I have diagnosed so often before. And the only difference was that I was oriented. I was obviously oriented. Even I had really some problems with my working memory for a while. This was in the time where I really got a lot of something like downloads. I never thought about before that someone really could have downloads, but it happened. And there was not enough capacity to process this. So I started doing phenomenological research about my own dissolution of the self, and compare this with lots of geropsychiatric, neuroscientific, and spiritual sciences for at least the last 3 years. I read and tried to understand what happened with me and compared it with dementia and with neuroscientific findings. So this was a really challenging process in my life, but I did it and I had to do it. I know I couldn't avoid it, and I knew I can understand dementia in a total different way on this path. At the beginning, I started to try to understand what does it mean, the experience of emptiness or nothingness, and what has to do with dementia. And I thought about that context matters in this topic, because the experience of emptiness or nothingness, like I had, is primarily known in spiritual Eastern traditions as a desired experiences. But it is happening there under guidance of an experienced teacher, of a lama, of a guru, with special practices before and after the experience. And you are guided through the physical, spiritual, and cognitive upheavals in the aftermath in a safe and caring environment. And after this happened to me, and I went through all these processes, and I saw the similarities to dementia in that what happened with me, I became more and more aware that these experiences also occur outside the traditional context, because I knew I was absolutely clear that when it happens it is happening in me, it also happening in nearly everybody. It can happen because it's nothing. I'm not special. This was not a special experience. This is the experience that is enfolded in human consciousness, and everybody can and will have this experience at some point of his or her existence. And I think that possible triggers for this experience of emptiness or nothingness in real life, in ordinary people, are intensive worldly practices like contemplative, with a contemplative meditative character, like doing jigsaw puzzles, as I did for very long time. And I know that it was the deep contemplation when I did, or a gradual dissolution of the self in the aging process. And I will come back to this later. And I think when people experience this in an environment which is not in a spiritual tradition, they experience the same upheavals, the same spiritual and cognitive confusions after that, but they have no knowledge, no guidance, no rituals, no safe spaces, and no validation. And so it was with me. It was really difficult to find people who could guide me. For the first years, I went through this mostly on my own because nobody understood me. And I tried to explain myself, but people were not able to listen to me. And it took really years, 4 years, until I found people, the first people where I could express myself better and could explain better what really happened with me. And I found a transpersonal psychotherapist who did who supervised me for more than 1.5 years. So this was really helpful. But if you have no knowledge, no guidance, no rituals, if you don't know what is happening, if you have such an experience and you experience all these changes in you, the result will be shame, confusion, despair, anxiety, withdrawal, silence, or rage. And if you know a little bit about dementia, you know that these are symptoms of people with dementia. So a lot of assumptions came up, and I call them assumptions at this moment, because I have a lot of evidence for all these findings, but I didn't have the time until now to go really deep into my data and to publish it. And I think it will take years. There's a lot of evidence in the neurosciences and in neuropsychiatric sciences that there are similarities. Like I can see that, and I will do the work later. So at the moment, I speak just about assumptions. In my understanding, dementia is the result of a gradual or abrupt dissolution of the self. And the causality, in my understanding, is the other way around, as the biomedical narrative is telling us. Normally, the biomedical narrative about dementia is saying that out of unexplainable reasons, and there's a lot about research about it, but with no real evidence for the explanations we get now, out of not explainable reasons, the synapses in the brain are beginning to dissolve in an old person, and when the synapses are dissolving more and more, the brain cell at the end of the synapse doesn't get any information any longer, will die. And when a lot of brain cells in the same area of the brain will die, we will get a loss of brain mass. And when you're looking into the computer in a computer tomography of the brain of the person with late stage dementia, you can see a loss of brain mass from up to 25%. This is the narrative which is told at the moment. We all believe that there's something going on in the brain we can't understand. The brain is dissolving, the synapses, the cells, and then the whole brain mass is dissolving. And due to this process, the self will dissolve. People will forget who they are, what they wanted to do, due to this biological process. And in my understanding, after my experiences and all the research I've done, I think it's the other way around. There's first the dissolution of the self, and it begins a long period before we see the embodiment of dementia. It begins in our 50s or in our 60s, when the self starts to dissolve. And if we don't become aware of this process, it will go on, and then the brain cells will dissolve because we don't use them any longer. This is more complex as I can express it here at the moment, but there's a lot of research going on at the moment, especially about the changing in the gray matter women during the menopause. It's shrinking. The gray matter in the menopause of women is shrinking, and it is rising again afterwards. So there is a change in the cognitive capacity of women during menopause. So there's a lot of nice little pieces of a puzzle we have to put together from a different perspective. Dementia symptoms are similar to the symptoms of the psychological and spiritual aftermath of spiritual transformative experience or the spiritual awakening. This is the other thing, and I have some evidence for that, especially out of 2 books, but there are, of course, more and more sources like this. If you know the book of Suzanne Segal, Collision with the Infinite, she describes there what happened with her after an awakening experience and the confusion she went through after that. But I especially recommend the book of Adyashanti, The End of Your Word. Adyashanti is an American spiritual teacher who unfortunately retired last year. This book, The End of Your Word, you can read it in some chapters like a description of dementia, and he's also comparing awakening, the aftermath after spiritual awakening with Alzheimer's at some point. I tried to get in contact with Adyashanti, but I just got a message from someone out of his sangha that he is that he's retired. So I would love to discuss this with him. Some assumptions about the unconscious emptiness in dementia. And by understanding the lack of awareness and the inability to assess the process of self-dissolution results into the inability to cope and to integrate. If you don't know what is happening with you, you can't cope. You are confused. You don't understand. You're disoriented. All the symptoms of dementia are rising out of this process of self-dissolution. And the emptiness is the only comforting place to escape all this experience. And you can see this. Go into nursing homes. One can easily witness this development in people with advanced severe dementia when you witness them with empathy and a non-attachment to the suffering that is witnessed. This is important. If you're attached to the suffering, then it is really difficult, because then you can't witness it, and you will suffer with them, or you have to reject the suffering. So we have really practiced to practice non-attachment, and I really recommend, if you wanted to become aware of this what is going on there, go into a nursing home as a volunteer into a nursing home for people with advanced, moderate, or severe dementia, and ask for working there for quite a while and get in contact. And you will, if you're sensitive enough, you will witness this unconscious emptiness, but at the same time be aware that there is a transmission also. People with dementia transmit the unconscious emptiness. And I think I got an overdose during my years there, because I was so sensitive for them. And this was part of my own developmental process. Another problem we have in our story about dementia at the moment is the perspective of a pathology. In Western culture, the dissolution of the self is usually understood as a pathology, and reports of this experience are therefore categorized as negative and pathological. So I recommend to go to your GP and tell him or her that you have the impression that there's no self in you anymore. And I think in more than 99%, you will get a prescription for some sedative medication, or he or she will send you to a psychiatrist and if also the psychiatrist has no awareness about consciousness development or spiritual awareness, the process of pathology the pathological process will continue in your diagnosis. So, or this we know intuitively, or we know it explicitly, and this is a hindrance for the self-report of perhaps natural experience of old age, what I think that the dissolution of the self is. And so I continue with some assumptions about aging and the dissolution of the self, because in my understanding and after my research and my reading about that, and what I sense about that is the dissolution of the self, the dissolution of the personal identity, the default task of aging. The self has to dissolve, it has to surrender to its own dissolution, at least in the last moment of the bodily existence. And dying into the transpersonal, die before you die, as Rumi often is quoted, or the unconscious, or the conscious dissolution of the self, as I call it, is, in my understanding, the evolutionary potential of aging. And especially in these times we are in, it's not just the evolutionary potential, it's the evolutionary task. For me, there is an obligation in that we as the elderly take this potential and act responsible with that, and really fulfill this task for consciously dissolve our personal self and die into the transpersonal. So perhaps this little picture can make it a little bit more clear. I tried to put together some different manifestations of self-awareness and the dissolution of self in elderhood. Like I can see it now. I've just here found 4 manifestations. I think we can differentiate much more, especially on the left side in the dementia process. We have at least 3 stages of dementia. In some other models, 4, 5, or 7 stages. I just took here the advanced dementia. But first, I refer to the differentiation as Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber is doing in the pre-personal, the personal, and the transpersonal consciousness, and I refer to some understanding of the I, or of the self, or of the personal narrative. I have no perfect description for that now, but I think it's a sense of I, it's a sense of self, and this is, I refer in my understanding also to the understanding of Carl Rogers of the fully functioning person as a fully developed personal consciousness, as in our late adulthood, in our elderhood, that we are really, really fully aware about ourselves, about our responsibilities on the personal level. And yes, and from this I, or understanding of self, I see 4 different manifestations. And I think the gravitational center of elderhood in humanity at the moment is that of aging, or the older person. And it's on the left, it's in the early expression of the personal consciousness, of the personal development. It has parts in the pre-personal and in the personal. And this is this manifestation of self-awareness of the aging, or the older person, is characterized through activity or continuity orientation, and later an increasing withdrawal or disengagement. And all these are gerontological theories of successful aging. We have an activity theory, we have a continuity theory, we have a disengagement theory about successful aging, and this characterized this manifestation of self-awareness in elderhood. it's a clinging to the persona or the self-identity, and it's characterized through a materialistic consciousness. And then we have a little bit more mature kind of elderhood that is the wise person or the elder. It is characterized through increasing fulfillment and detachment from one's own role or persona. It includes an increasing transcendence. With this expression, I refer to the work of a Swedish gerontologist, Lars Tornstam, who did a study about transcendence, with which he means the increasing ego transcendence in elderhood and fully developed humanistic consciousness. And then there is another kind of manifestation of self-awareness arising in old age. And this is what I call the transcendent being, where the dissolution of the personal identity is more or less fulfilled, where there is an increasing realization of the higher self or the divine impulse in ourselves, and more and more connection to the cosmic consciousness. And I think there are later and even more realized manifestations of elderhood, but I think it's enough for now. And on the other side, there is the advanced dementia, characterized to the increasing disorientation in the word or in one's own person, a dissolution of personal identity, and a withdrawal into pre-personal consciousness. So these are 4 different possible manifestations of awareness and of selfhood in the elderly. And you see these small arrows there. I think there's development possible from every state to the higher or more mature state of being, even from dementia to the aging person. I think if we become aware about this process of the dissolution of the self, that you can change this development in the early states of dementia. I don't feel allowed to speak about later stages at the moment. And there's these dotted lines in the other direction. We are never safe in our development. And when we are going this path to more and more realization, we have to be aware that there's always a fallback position. And I have some evidence about people who were really highly spiritual, developed, highly well known in their wisdom and their spiritual beingness, and they went into dementia in their last years. And there are different reasons for that. Some reasons can be that they did a spiritual practice that dissolved the brain, and they were not able to stop that at the right point. And then there's another thing, that the spiritual ego is always with us, and it will not stop, even not in the highest states of development. And so we have to work with our spiritual ego really until our last moment, because the spiritual ego can draw us into dementia too. So this is my full truth. When I'm really open, and it took a little bit of courage to put this hypothesis in here, and I hope we can talk about that later. Dementia and spiritual awakening are, in my understanding, the 2 ends of a spectrum of consciousness with a similar underlying phenomenological experience, the dissolution of the self. And you can see this spectrum of consciousness in elderhood. And there is, at the one end, there is the embodiment of the full forgetting of one's own being, of one's human nature, and if we want to put it more spiritual, of the divine nature of human being. And that is a person in a severe in a state of severe dementia. This person has fully forgotten its own nature. And on the other side, there is the fully realized, fully embodied, spiritual awakened person. And I really think it has to be fully embodied, because a lot of people are awakening in the last years and at the moment. But it is a different if you're just awakened and you have a knowledge about the nature of this existence, or if you have it really embodied. And these people, these few people who have really embodied the spiritual awakening, these are the other end of the spectrum of consciousness, when you really embody the knowledge about the divine nature of this human existence. And both the person who has fully forgotten the divine nature and the person who has fully embodied the divine nature of our existence, they're both characterized through the dissolution of the self, of the personal identity, and just two totally different kinds of lives lived to that. So just one last slide. So here the gerontologist comes back, and I have some gerontological conclusion, and I think it is possible to make people aware of the process of self-dissolution through timely information and education about the naturalness of this dissolution process, through appropriate measurement, through adult development assessments instead of dementia assessments. I think this is a really, really important thing. Through guidance with consciousness work. And the aim about all that is to support people in at least halting a process of pre-personal development that has already begun, to stabilize the personal identity, or if I'm very courageous, probably to reverse and guide the consciousness development into a transpersonal direction. Yeah, I think we can discuss that soon. I just have some information for you about me and my work, especially for people who will hear this later on YouTube. If you want to hear more about my approach on dementia and about my research, please go to my website, bettinawichers.de. That's also my email. I'm doing coaching again after I stopped working for quite a while due to this process, and I underwent in the last years a really difficult phase due to this process, and I stopped working for nearly 3 years. So I lived without an income, and I lived from my resources, and I need now really support to continue this research. And if you think this work is important and you can afford it, I'm really happy if you can support my research financially. This is my PayPal account, or if you send me an email, I can send you my bank account. And especially you can support me in sharing this research and my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. That was a very powerful presentation. I really like the notion of a continuum between breakdown and breakthrough, as it were, because I was wanting to say, as I was hearing you talk, that surely there's a major difference between the dissolution of the self on the path to enlightenment and the dissolution, I would say, not of the self, but of the ego. In the Freudian sense, the ego is that which kind of holds our world together. But right at the end, you explained that It's actually a continuum. I think one of the challenges is that the people that often suffer from dementia, in the kind of the clinical sense of the dissolution of sort of the ego and the capacity to kind of keep the self, the larger psychic wholeness together, are often people that don't have the spiritual or psycho-emotional tools to do that, and that's why they've succumbed to dementia.
Yeah.
So how one works with sort of a clinical situation of, it's like someone coming in, with a broken arm, you can't expect them to throw a baseball. How do you understand that complexity between someone who's actually suffering an illness and transforming that illness into a strength when they don't have the capacity, in this case of dementia, of holding the ego together?
I don't share this idea that it is a dissolution of the ego. I know that this is what is always talked about, especially in the spiritual communities and in psychological communities, because since I had this experience and I've witnessed so many people with dementia, it's really a dissolution of the self.
Oh, okay.
This is really a difference, because you're sitting there and there is no body. You can't find anybody in yourself. That is totally different from that what is normally described with the dissolution of the ego, because the ego is still there. If you sit with people with dementia in the agitated phases, you will experience a lot of ego.
Mm-hmm.
This is the pre-personal part. This will keep with them, they will stick with them for a very long time. But what they're really getting lost is a sense of self. Who am I? This sense is going lost. And this is really, and I experienced this so deep, and it was really a deep despair, because there's no explanation in this word how to deal with that when you don't find anybody. There's a diagnosis, and I got this several times. Oh, that's a depersonalization disorder, what you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, you can say that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you, as I've read so many other descriptions, especially from the spiritual traditions. I understood that it is really we are so used in our world to pathologize every experience that is not according to the.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
yeah. So what is, if dementia really? It's, for me, it's really not a disease. We are so used to see it as a disease, but we have not. We are looking at the 80, 90, 100-year-old person who's lying in her bed or who can't orient herself any longer. But we know that dementia is starting 20, 30 years before. So I'm 56 now. The dementia process is going on in me, and I'm not sure if I will develop dementia in my later life. It's starting now. And for me, it is really this.
So you're saying it's basically a natural process
It's a
that
natural
becomes
process.
pathologized.
Yeah. And because I recognize how much anxiety has arisen in me when I was sitting there and trying to understand what happened with me when there was no self, and I had to deal with this experience of nothingness, of absolute nothingness. If you really had just a glimpse, and Adyashanti is describing this very beautiful. He said people have just small glimpses of that, and after that, never nothing is again like it was before. And when I think people who don't have my capacities, no, not my mind, not my knowledge like I had, would have just a glimpse. They couldn't get it really. But everything is different after that.
Well, let's dive in. Speak to us about the difference between say, Alzheimer's and dementia. I understand that dementia is the broad category of sort of, let's call it dissolution. And then Alzheimer's is a particular kind of dementia.
Yeah.
But, those people who have parents or siblings with Alzheimer's, I think they would understand that as really something that is a disease, as it were. It's not just a natural process. But you're saying that even Alzheimer's is basically a natural process that has been pathologized.
No, stop. Alzheimer's, that's what we recognize at the end phase of Alzheimer's, when people are really fully disoriented in their life.
They don't recognize anyone.
Yeah. This is the end of a process of unconscious dissolution. And they're going into the pre-personal direction. When you're sitting with a person, when you're living with a person with Alzheimer's, you will recognize that they were going back and back and back and back into former expressions of their self. They're becoming, in their mind, in their self-awareness, every day a little bit younger version of themselves. They're going totally back. And when you follow someone, and it's better to do it with a non-relative, because then you're not so attached. And I had the possibilities to follow people for up to 8 years in a nursing home. You will see that they're going back, and we are caring so well for them that at the end we care for bodies who are not aware about anything, and they're really going in a very early state. And when you put them in the bath, it's really like a very early state of a human being in a very, very old body. So in my understanding, they're projecting every day a younger version of themselves onto the world.
Yeah. That's it. That's a very interesting way to look at it. I appreciate that. Now, Stan Pakros was raising the point about dementia, and I guess even Alzheimer's, is a form of defense mechanism. What would you say about that?
Against what? Defense mechanism against what?
Well, maybe, just a reality that's too complicated or too alienating. And so people just retreat back into, like
not everybody had an awakening experience, of course. But they all experience a dissolution of their identity. They can't orient themselves any longer. They are not able to go into the transpersonal. For me, aging, the transpersonal development is the evolutionary potential of aging. It is meant to go this way, to transform our personal identity into a transpersonal identity. And if you don't have the capacities, you will become confused, because you can't stay into this personal identity. You know that it will die. You don't have the capacities to deal with the more rising complexity, but you don't know what to do. You don't understand the word any longer. And so you retreat yourself and you avoid to think. And when you avoid to think, and when you avoid to deal with this word, your brain will dissolve. You're going into this unconscious emptiness, that's what I said, because it's the only comforting place. When you're in the emptiness, nobody will disturb you. Mm-hmm. But when you're here and awake, there is always something you don't understand. This is where I really recommend going into a nursing home as a volunteer. Because most people are looking from the outside, and they don't have really an idea what it means, what dementia really means, and how it feels from the inside.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, many people go into old age without dementia.
Yeah.
They're clear until the day they die.
Yeah.
So how does that fit into your understanding of this being a natural process?
Yeah, I think they're following the process. They accept the aging. They accept that they can't adjust to everything any longer. They find their way. Perhaps they have really fulfilled their divine impulse. They know why they are here, and they accept that they will dissolve.
So it's the fact that they're conscious of the dissolution that keeps them in some way clear.
Yeah.
And that when you're not conscious of the dissolution,
Yeah.
it erodes your ego capacity to keep it all together, shall we say. That's kind of a loose term. It's not clinical, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gotcha. So it's a matter of either an unconscious process that's destructive,
Yeah.
or a conscious process that maintains clarity.
Or that accepts the deconstruction, that accepts that the dissolving goes on, because we have to dissolve. This stuff has to dissolve. And when you accompany dying people, you will recognize that some of them can't die because that's the ego. Then the ego can't let go its own existence. So they prolong the dying process because they're fighting against this dissolution. And people with dementia.
Go ahead, finish.
No.
Well, I should say, I know my mother, for example, is probably pretty common in some ways, old school Italian, lived to 95, was clear as a bell, had a few ailments, her knees were creaky and stuff, but she began to become aware that it was her time.
Yeah.
And then one Sunday afternoon, she said to me, because I was with her through the whole process, she said, "Jimmy, I'm ready." And so we called the hospice nurse, and the nurse says, "Well, if you go without food and water for 3 days, you'll pass." So I explained it to my mother, and I said, "If you're really ready, then what they're saying is that if you stop eating and drinking, that will induce the process." She says, "Oh, good." And she stopped drinking and eating. And on Thursday, 3 days later, 4 days later, she passed.
Yeah.
But so that would be an example for you of someone who is aware, consciously aware, that the process was taking place, and it was getting to the point of dissolution, and she needed to surrender to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Because that's, as they say, that's a beautiful death.
Yeah. That is full acceptance of the dissolution of this existence. And it hasn't been so spiritual as I put it, but we are growing more and more in the spiritual dimension. Yeah.
Right.
But this is I would say, I don't know nothing about your mother, but perhaps she was an example was this older person with a very normal life. She didn't had a lot. I don't know if she was very intellectual. Yeah. She just had an intuitive understanding that her life will end, and she accepted that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's the simple people. She was a simple Italian woman, loved the kitchen, always was bustling about, wanting to make sure everybody was well fed, wasn't an intellectual, had no specific, I think she was Christian because my father was, but wasn't herself very religious or doctrinal, but had a deep compassion for the world, I would say. And you just think of an old school, old country Sicilian woman would be my mother. And oftentimes that simplicity is what allows the naturalness of the passage. And in our Western world, where we give people drugs and we try to artificially prolong, and we use all kinds of medical interventions, that interrupts a natural process and deprives people of the beauty of the passing.
Yeah. And all this anti-aging talks,
Yeah.
It's part of this process that tells us that we can survive forever. And of course, there's an ego, because the ego wants that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's so interwoven in our culture now that we have to live forever or as long as possible. People fear dementia more than death. That is an interesting thing. But at the same time, they don't want the death either. So it's really this, I
Yeah,
want
they
to live
can't bear to
forever.
think about death, but they know they want to avoid dementia.
And
Yeah,
that people
good point. Good
People
point.
are committing suicide because they're so afraid of getting dementia.
Wow. 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 Now, what would you say to the person watching right now, middle age, maybe in the 50s or 60s, that know that they're mortal, are not trying to prolong anything? Are there particular practices? Are there particular techniques? Are there particular orientations of mind and heart that you would recommend that kind of prepares people to deal with this dissolution of the self that inevitably comes?
Yeah, I'm at the beginning of this process to develop something like that. But the first thing is become aware of the dissolution of yourself. If we become aware that this is a natural process.
Yeah. Become aware that that's actually the issue in dying.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is the issue in aging, and that it
Yeah.
can be a beautiful thing. And if we talk about more about this pre-personal, personal, transpersonal, that there is not, for me, it was really this question, this personal identity is gone. And this really, it was difficult for a while, because I recognized without an identity, it is impossible to live in this life. And all these spiritual, highly developed people who are so often referred to, like Ramana Maharshi or something like, they were just sitting in their caves first, so that they didn't live the life in a normal context. But if you have to live a life in a normal context, you have to have some kind of identity. And I think there will be another identity, and this is what I call perhaps a transpersonal identity, or really becoming aware about the divine impulse that is enfolded in me. What is this meant for? And this is spiritual. And for me, the early elderhood is meant for that. Leaning back, thinking about my life, what have I done? What is that for what I'm here? And do I have fulfilled this? Do I have fulfilled this, what I'm here for? And then, like your mother, there will be that when you're aware of what's your divine impulses, what you're meant for, and you try to fulfill that as good as it is possible for the rest of your life, then there will be the point where you say, it's done.
Mhm.
I can go.
Mhm. Mhm.
But and this is,
Yeah. Good. No, finish.
yeah, this is what I think what the first work is that we have to do, becoming aware of the different that aging is really a spiritual path.
Yes.
It has a spiritual potential, and we have to fulfill this. We have to become aware, and then becoming a witness of our own dissolution. Really, for people who are really fearful, start journaling about what is happening with you, and become aware of that, and then look what you can do with that. And as long as I am aware, I will become forgetful, I will become disoriented, because life will be more and more complex, and I can't hold all that in my old age. So I will accept that I'm becoming more and more forgetful, but I will try to organize my life in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So old age is not meant for traveling the whole world any longer, or getting
Mm.
a new Netflix series from the beginning to the end, or something like that. Yeah. So
Well, I'm 73 years
Mhm.
old,
Yeah.
and inevitably, the resilience of the body
Yeah.
surrenders to the gravity of mortality. And, as the Desiderata says, surrender gracefully the things that are youth. And I find that as I'm trying to understand what you're saying, which I think is very profound and sublimely beautiful, one, as the body weakens, the spirit becomes more alive.
Yes.
And my awareness of the vastness of eternity, and that all I've been giving is a speck of a flicker of time.
Yeah.
And that as I'm realizing that it's coming into 10, 20, maybe 30 years, who knows, but in the downward slope, what is naturally arising in me is more and more concentration on the invisible realms, spiritual realms, the sense of oneness between my Atman and the Brahman, to use a Hindu symbolism. And I think that's what you're calling for, is that as we age, we need to embrace this notion that we're spiritual beings having a human experience.
Yes. Yes. And I go a step further. When I'm really courageous, for me, this existence came out of nothingness.
Yeah.
We call it DNA.
Yeah.
And the egg
Good
and
point.
sperm. So we have theories about that. But if we go deeply into that, this came out of nothingness. This is when we go into quantum physics. This is nothingness, is in experience, but it is the ground is nothingness. And this life, for me, the full fulfillment of this existence would be in the full fulfillment of the rainbow body, going into nothingness again, really dissolving into the knowledge of the illusion of this own existence. But this is really very spiritual. But I'm doing a lot of contemplation about that, because for me it's obvious now.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
and
I think
we are at the half time of evolution in this understanding.
Well, now you're plumbing into the depths of nirvana.
Yeah.
And that's where the Buddha ended up. He says,
Yeah.
you can talk about Atman and Brahman and eternity and limit, finitude, but that's all an illusion.
Yeah.
The reality is it's all nothingness.
Nothingness.
And it's out of the nothingness, this great line of the Buddhas that emptiness is the cradle of compassion.
Yeah.
So what you're contemplating is the ultimate, if that's the void. And if one can then rest in the void, then you're ready for anything.
Yeah.
If you truly experientially rest in the void and understand that you're the void in a brief flicker of configuration of sacred geometry, mathematics, and spirit. I mean, yeah, that's good. That's good.
But we have to be aware when we talk about that we are far away from this. And even when I had this experience of nothingness, and I went but I'm living still in a total different world. And we have to learn to live with this paradox.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important that we don't try to do something like spiritual bypassing with it. These are possibilities for me, in my understanding. But the reality is total different at the moment, and we have to navigate this very carefully. And so, if I talk about the rainbow body, it's for me, it's really a really interesting perspective. I have some friends with whom I can talk about that. But we are really on the halfway. At the moment, we are still in the experience of a body, and you're having the experience of a body, and I have the experience of a body. And yeah, so yeah.
Now let's end with this question from Rita Marsh, which I think is really good, Rita. Thank you. Is there the essence of love in the nothingness. How do you understand, Bettina, the role of love in this passage into the dissolution of the self?
This is really a thing of language, because that what most people understand as love is, for me, being. Just this creation, I don't have this understanding of love as most people have that. So it's really, it's a difficult situation when people ask me that, and I don't have that. In this nothingness.
How is love being for you? I mean, let's pause for a moment. If
it's just
love being, how do you understand that?
It's really this. Sometimes I'm really overfloated, or I don't know the right expression, überflutet in German, from this existence, just from the pure existence.
And you're overflowing.
Yeah, overflowing. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think something like this is the creative impulse behind all this. There is this experience of singularity. When you're in the nothingness, you're making the experience of this singularity out of this rise, the Big Bang, or however we want to put it. And this is pure creational energy. And I think a lot of people understand this as love for this existence. And for me, it's just this. Yeah.
It is existence.
It is existence. It is just wow. It's just this wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's very profound. Back to Heidegger, being and nothingness.
Yeah.
Being is what contains it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it arises out of the nothingness. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful notion. Very beautiful notion. Well, thank you so much. This has been very deep. I love this notion of the continuum.
Yeah.
And that the continuum between the dissolution as a destructive aspect and constructive aspect is based on your consciousness.
Yeah.
It's like Jung said, he said how he differentiated between a consciousness and unconsciousness. He says, if you fall into a hole unconsciously, you're kind of falling backwards.
Mm-hmm.
If you're falling into a hole consciously, you're intending to fall and you fall forwards.
Yeah.
And I think that pertains to what you're saying.
Mm.
So it comes back to this awareness inside all of us, which, as you're saying, ultimately is one's relationship with the totality. Because that's what gives us the aperture of consciousness or unconsciousness. It's the way we're interpreting the data in some way. Because as he says, you're going to fall either way. Yes. The only question is whether you're going to fall backwards and unconsciously and hurt yourself.
Yeah.
Or you're going to fall consciously, intentionally, and land on your feet. Yeah. And I think that's the essence of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and I like this constructive thing. I don't know if I got it right, but we are able to construct the next step and our identity and life and so, but we have to take the responsibility. We are creation and creator at the same moment, and with this comes a deep responsibility. And when we step out of this responsibility and we give up the responsibility to someone else, I don't want to think longer. I don't want to care for myself any longer. And this is what is happening in aging. Mm-hmm. Then it goes this downward path. Yeah. And we have to construct the next moment, and the next moment will include the death, the next moment of the death. And we have to act responsible for that. And no one can take responsibility for our consciousness development. And that is the truth behind dementia and Alzheimer's. a lot of people have a lot of pity for people with dementia, and I don't have that. There was a point they decided actively to go this path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not actively but they decided not to take responsibility for their own life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is a hard message.
Yeah. 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 Well, there you have it, everyone. We are the created and the creator simultaneously, and therein lies our responsibility. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. That's the essence of our humanity.
That is. That
recognition
is.
of our totality.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have some evidence now from interviews, especially from a father of a friend of mine, who at the end of his 40s said, there's no I any longer. So he was aware very early, and I think a lot of people can come to the recognition in our 50s, 60s, 70s. This is the time where we still are able to act responsible. And when we talk more about it and say, yes, that's normal, that's nothing pathological that there is no I. That's great that there is no I. Hey, let's look what we can do without this personal self. How great the next creation can be.
You know, maybe that's why they call it the golden years. It's the time of life when you're losing it, but you wake up to the reality behind it.
Wake up. Waking up is the potential of aging.
Bettina, thank you so much. Really appreciate this depth of wisdom that you glean. You know, it says in the book of Hebrews that Jesus learned obedience through what he suffered.
Yeah.
And you had an experience that was deeply impactful because you had to go through a dark night.
Yeah.
You've come out, you know, a very wise woman. And I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for sharing with us the wisdom that you've gleaned. Thank you. You can join Bettina in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you all receive the link in your Zoom reminder for today. Then we'll see you tomorrow again on Humanity Rising. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.